are having one of our historic moments for the Wade Center. This is our first webinar and live streaming event, and we are using it in order to launch a fantastic book that has been written by Gina Dalfonzo. It is called Dorothy and Jack, The Transforming Friendship of Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis. So I want to give you some logistical guidance before I introduce Gina and we start talking about the book. First of all, later on, David Downing, my co-director at the Wade, will be joining us to coordinate a question and answer time. So anytime during my conversation with Gina, you can hit the Q&A button and upload a question, and David will be collecting those for later on. You only should use the chat app if you have some tech problems you want to discuss. We have two of our Wade staff online waiting to handle those. Then at the end of the question and answer time, 3 very fortunate people will be selected from among you all listening to receive a free copy of Gina's book that she will autograph for you. So there is a lot to look forward to tonight. First of all, thanks, Gina, for joining me tonight to converse about your book. And let me give some background to everybody about your work. The Dorothy and Jack has been published by Baker Books, which published 3 years ago another book by Gina called One by One, Welcoming the Singles in Your Church, which is a fantastic conversational topic. The church needs to be thinking more about this. Gina is also editor of Gospel and Dickens, selections from his works, and she's founder and editor of Dickens blog. So those of you who are Charles Dickens fans, and I'm one of them, you might consider checking that out. And she's published numerous essays in important journals like The Atlantic, Christianity Today, First Things, and many more. Gina has a master's in English from George Mason University. She lives in Virginia, and she is currently a columnist at Christ and Pop Culture. So, Gina, let's talk about Dorothy and Jack. First of all, I want to know what ignited the project. What made you think of paralleling the friendship of C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers?
Well, first of all, thank you for this. Thank you so much for this event, for having me here. I'm just so happy to be with the Wade Center, even halfway across the country. So the book had its origin many years ago, although I didn't know it then. I was taking a class at Messiah College, where we both used to be, which I believe is now Messiah University, actually.
Yes.
But at the time it was Messiah College. So I took a class on theology and Oxford Christian writers, which happened to be the same Oxford Christian writers that the Wade Center curates or studies. So that was when I started reading Sayers, when I started reading Lewis more than I had only read a little bit of his work at that point, and Tolkien and Williams and the rest. And at the time, I was so taken with these writers, and especially with Lewis and Sayers. So I went out and started reading everything I could find by them, including their collected letters. There were something like 4 volumes of Sayers letters, and of course, Lewis left an immense number of letters. And it was impossible not to notice that the two of them often wrote to each other. So this is a friendship that I often say was hiding in plain sight. I mean, the information was all there. We knew that they are two of the Oxford Christian writers, so to speak. We knew that they knew each other. Sayers is even sometimes called an honorary inkling, although she wasn't really, but just as an acknowledgement of her connection with Lewis and Williams and her interest in a lot of the same issues. So this connection was known about and yet not really known about. There aren't a lot of people who talk about it, not nearly as much as talk about Lewis and Tolkien, Lewis and the Inklings, and so forth. So I was looking for a book topic to follow up one by one. And I started thinking about this again. And, Lewis used to say, write the books you want to read. Well, this was a book that I thought I would want to read. I would want this friendship sort of brought out in the open and talked about and studied, because it was so interesting, and their letters to each other were so delightful. I mean, two great minds connecting with each other on such a level. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, good. And the title of your book, I consider absolutely brilliant. The subtitle, The Transforming Friendship of Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis. And why it's brilliant is there's multiple meanings there. First of all, that the friendship transformed over the years, but also that the friendship was transforming insofar as Lewis transformed Sayers and Sayers transformed Lewis. So let's talk about those three components of your book. First of all, how did their friendship itself transform?
Well, it started out as a professional relationship. She wrote to him to praise something that he had written. He wrote back presumably to thank her. We don't actually have those early letters, which is a great shame. I know. Something you hope will turn up in an attic someday or whatever.
Yes.
But for a long time, they talked work. and over the years, and that was the kind of friendship that they both really loved, the kind where you could just talk shop all the time. That was their thing. That was what helped them connect quicker than any other way. But over the years, it became more of what we might recognize as a friendship. They even started to talk about personal things eventually, which for them was a big deal. So there's a quote from Lewis that I used towards the end of the book. This isn't really a spoiler. It's just towards the end of the book, where someone once wrote to Lewis to talk about the Inklings and their allies. And he mentioned Sayers as one of the allies, and Lewis very firmly corrected him about Sayers. She was a friend. She was not an ally, she was a friend. And it was very important to him to make that clear. And I find that quote very moving, because that's what it was. It was a friendship. I mean, he was connected with so many people. He had so many correspondents, so many people he knew through his work, just tons of people. And yet he had some people who were just friends. Another time he called her one of his real friends. So as opposed to just an ordinary correspondent. So over the years, this went from what might have been called just an alliance to a genuine friendship.
Mm-hmm. So then, how was it that Lewis helped change or transform Sayers?
Lewis, I think, would have been a little shocked at the notion that he did transform Sayers. He in that same letter I referenced earlier, he sort of was self-deprecating about the notion that he could have changed anybody, or he and his friends changed each other. But he was an encouragement to her, I think, when she needed that. And that in itself was a great influence. She didn't always feel comfortable in the role of apologist. She would complain to him about it. She would say, this comes naturally to you, it doesn't to me. It was not her. She didn't consider it her primary calling, and that made her feel very uneasy, because for her, calling was so important. So he was adamant that it was at least part of her calling that she was good at it, that she should keep doing it. And sometimes she would snap at him, and he would basically say, okay, but I still think you're very good at it. And I think maybe he made her feel more comfortable and more fitted to that work over the years.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps helped change his attitudes about women as well. As an Oxford Don, he didn't encounter many. He lived with Mrs. Moore, who tended to not at all be an intellectual equal. And here was Dorothy Sayers, who would talk back to him. She would challenge him. I think a lot of people would just enjoy some of the quotations from your book where Sayers is just saying, I don't like this when you say this. And one of your chapter titles is, hey, whoa. And that's actually a quotation from one of C.S. Lewis's letters when Sayers was challenging him about issues of vocation, as you're talking about. So I think she probably was part of the transformation that prepared him for Joy Davidman, another brilliant woman that, of course, he ended up marrying.
I just had to use that "hey, whoa" quote, and I came across it again.
How then do you see C.S. Lewis affecting Sayers? How was he part of her transforming?
Well, that I think that he just helped her feel more comfortable in that role of apologist. And also, I almost wonder a little bit if perhaps he helped change her attitude about single people a little bit, because she tended to take the attitude, at least at first, that as a single man, there were certain things he just shouldn't talk about, and he just didn't know about, and he should stay away from. And she wasn't, I don't think she was always wrong about that, but I think maybe he helped her adjust her attitude a little bit to where she could be more open about that sort of thing, and say, okay, yes, maybe a single person has something to say that should be considered.
Right. I love that the first letter, and you quote from this in your book, when part of Lewis transforming Sayers, as we're talking about, where she acknowledges the difference. So his helping her with apologetics, and she says to him, you like souls, I don't. And she's partly being facetious, of course, but she is just will not tiptoe around things. And Sayers is one of those people, when you read her letters, you just laugh out loud. I can't believe she just said that. Mm-hmm. And hence, Lewis describing her, and you quote this in your book, that she was one of the best letter writers in the English language. Mm-hmm. He so admired her letter writing.
Yes, and that was high praise, because he was no slouch in that department himself. I mean, goodness knows he had lots of practice. He wrote tons of letters, but her letters just impressed him so much, and he kept saying that, and he would say, I love to get your letters, other people's letters sort of annoy me sometimes, but your letters I look forward to. I wish I had more time to answer them. So yes, as you said, he was full of praise for her letter writing skills. And those letters are wonderful. I mean, I've read them so many times. My copies are all dog-eared and marked up and bookmarked. She just expresses herself with such honesty and such humor. And she's honest about herself. That's one of the things I love most about her. And she puts a lot of that into her fictional characters too, which I like. But I mean, she sees herself very honestly, expresses herself very forthrightly about it. I quote in the book from a Screw Tape parody that she did, which very early on in the friendship, she wrote Lewis this sort of mock Screw Tape letter. And the thing that Screw tape parodies are not my favorite genre as a rule, because so many people have tried them and they just don't always work. What I love about hers, one thing that I love about hers is that the demon whose persona she's adopting, he says all kinds of nasty things about her. So she uses the genre to sort of poke fun at herself a little bit and to look honestly at her faults, which not everybody does use it that way. And I think Lewis liked that in her too, that forthright honesty, humility, self-awareness.
Yeah, good. As you were paralleling their lives and their friendship, did you run into anything that really surprised you?
There were a couple of things. I had forgotten that she didn't really care for mere Christianity very much, and I'm not sure why. I don't remember her saying a great deal about why. Just that she didn't. I don't think it was the theology per se, because she says elsewhere that she thinks his theology is sound. So I'm not quite sure what that was about. We know that Lewis didn't care for Gaudy Night for his part, but that was mainly because I think he just didn't care for mysteries in general. They weren't his thing. But I still haven't figured out that mere Christianity thing. Another thing that surprised me, and this is only indirectly about them, was sort of digging into Charles Williams' life a little bit. Williams being a mutual friend of theirs. And just some of the stuff he was into. I sort of knew a little bit about his interest in the occult. I didn't know it went quite as deep as it did. So that was kind of a surprise. But it was something I don't think either of them was fully aware of, or maybe even partially aware of. I don't think they really grasped that at all about him.
Yeah, in fact, both Lewis and Sayers have this adulatory response to Charles Williams. I think it was Lewis who said that Williams had the face of an angel, and Sayers was so profoundly affected by Charles Williams, the figure of Beatrice, that Sayers became a Dante scholar because of Williams. So that was a smart thing that you did, is showing one of the parallels in their friendship was their parallel interest in Williams, who had this part of his life that is something that people have been questioning. So that was quite helpful. One of the, I just love so much about this book, but one of the things I thought was fantastic is how you start the book with the timeline. And you just go year by year saying, here's what Sayers is doing, here is what Lewis is doing. And in my own scholarship, I'm working on another book on Sayers and have one coming out. And I would just go to your timeline, because I go, now what year was that she moved from Hull back to Oxford? I go, oh, Gina will tell me. And you have unearthed things that I hadn't noticed before. Like, this is so exciting. And correct me if I remember wrongly, that Sayers moved back to Oxford the day after Lewis moved to Oxford to start his university training, and that they lived only like half a mile apart, did you say? And the chances are that in 1917, Lewis and Sayers crossed paths, because she was working for a publisher, and Lewis probably went into the bookstore, Blackwell's bookstore. I mean, they might well have seen each other before their actual letter writing friendship started in 1942. So just little tidbits like that are really fun. So I thank you for that element. Another thing that I really enjoyed was your prose. You have a beautiful writing style. And I want to tell everybody out there, this book is a sheer joy to read because of Gina's good prose style.
Thank you.
For instance, her opening line of the book is, "They could not have been more alike." And then she shows the various ways they're alike. And then she goes, "They could not have been more different." And then she talks about that. That's so much more intriguing than to say, Lewis and Sayers had many similarities and differences. So one of my greatest compliments to a writer is when both their form and content are a pleasure to read. And so you gave that to us.
Thanks.
Now, there are some extra tidbits that tie into my life insofar as Gina and I share several things in common. One of the things we share is that in the start of our research, as I was starting to research my first Sayers book and she started to research her book, we were both given a Kilby Award from the Wade. And that was, for me, long before I ever knew I would be a co-director of the Wade. So I wonder if you could talk about your experience doing research at the Wade Center.
Oh, that was so much fun. And this just shows everybody what a nerd I am. That research at the Wade was a dream and so much fun. One of the most fun things I could imagine doing. To be there with all that material, the letters and papers that they left and things like that. To see them firsthand, to go through them. I was copying things down like crazy. And the best part was when I would find a letter that isn't in the collected volumes of letters that have been published. Oh my gosh.
That was that fun.
That it feels positively miraculous. Like, oh, here it is. It's been here all this time and I get to see it and now I can put it in my book and this is so exciting. I loved it. And then to get the Kilby grant, as you said, that was amazing experience because it was validating and it was helpful and it just made me feel part of a group of winners that had come before me, like you, who had done important and significant work in this area, and to be a part of that was just such an honor.
Mm. So you came out to the Wade to do research. Did you make any trips to England to visit sites relevant to Lewis and Sayers?
I didn't do that while researching the book, but I had done that in years past. I had been to an Oxbridge event where they talk about Lewis and Sayers and Tolkien and the other writers. Had been to both Oxford and Cambridge, seen some of the sites and the places that were so important in their lives. And one thing I did that I'll never forget, somebody helped me find the spot where Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane kiss for the first time in Oxford in Gaudy Night, because, you know, she gives you such a detailed and helpful map of the area, basically, of the whole school and city and everything in that book. And so, you know, you're able to pinpoint places like this. So somebody showed me that spot and I took a picture of it. I still have it somewhere.
Yeah. I have another little tidbit to share that Gina and I have in common. We already mentioned the fact that we were both at Messiah. Gina started Messiah a couple years before I did, but she started as a student, and several years later, I started as a professor, my first tenure track job after I got the PhD. And I'm wondering, Gina, whether you remember the first conversation you and I had at Messiah.
I remember it so well because I was going to be working on my, I think they call it the senior honors project.
Mhm.
And I had decided that I wanted to do it about Sayers. And I was looking for an advisor and somebody suggested you. And I was very shy and nervous. I was kind of a shy person at the time, still am a little bit. And I just approached you. I think it was in the cafeteria.
It was. Oh, you remembered. Yeah.
Yes, and asked you if you could be advisor on this project about Sayers. And as soon as I said Sayers, you perked up. And of course, I had no way of knowing of your interest. So it was quite providential, really.
Yeah, it was providential because since I had just arrived as a professor, you hadn't taken any English classes from me. And I remember somebody was just, I was going to lunch with a professor in the English department, and they say, "Oh, have you met Gina Dalfonzo?" And I said, "No." And then you just brought up Sayers. And just several months earlier, I had accompanied my husband, David, who I will be introducing just in a moment. He had been asked to speak at Wheaton College about C.S. Lewis. And that was in the late 90s. And it was our first experience of the Wade. And that was before we ever, before the new building was constructed. So I decided that I needed to have my own project. So I kind of chose Sayers just because she was the only woman in the entire Wade collection. I wasn't particularly a fan of detective fiction, but Sayers, just her letters, C.S. Lewis is right. Dorothy Sayers is one of the great letter writers in the English language. So it's funny when people ask me, well, what's your favorite Sayers text? I mean, I love Gaudy Night, but I'd say her collected letters. They are just amazing.
They are.
Yeah. So because of this, Gina and I met weekly her senior year and discussed Sayers. So I attribute my first book, which was on Sayers years ago, to these conversations with Gina. She really, we were able to mentor each other, and I learned a lot from her. And so it just, this brings me such pleasure that your book has been anticipated by the Kilby Grant, and now your book is the first webinar book launch in the history of the Wade. I mean, it's wonderful. So I'm sure some people have come up with questions. David Downing, my co-director, who is a C.S. Lewis specialist, as many of you know, has been culling those questions, and he might have some questions of his own to give to Gina. So David, what questions have you come up with?
Yes, I have been receiving questions here online. I feel like a DJ saying, here's our big request for the evening. So let me go ahead and direct some questions to Gina that are coming in from our listeners. Sydney Swanson from Oregon asked, did they ever recommend fiction to each other? Sydney is herself a successful YA writer, and she wants to know if they ever said, oh, you should read this novel or read that story. How much did they exchange their taste in terms of fiction writing?
Now, offhand, I can't think of a lot of fiction, but I can think of some recommendations that are interesting. He recommended that she read his brother Warren's book, or what, I think one of his books. I think he wrote more than one, on French history. So,
right.
And she promised she was going to run right out and buy it, because she was also very interested in French history. And so when she met Warren Lewis, they actually hit it off very well. So there's that. And I do remember a time, and I talk about this in the book, when he suggested that she get a book by a writer called Joy Davidman.
Right.
And that was Smoke on the Mountain. And so I believe, yes, she did get that one as well. As far as fiction, I can't, Lewis would say things like, you know, I hope you'll like Milton, that sort of thing, rather early on in their friendship. And it turned out she didn't care for Milton quite as much as he did. She had some issues with Milton, but that was one, if not a recommendation, then at least something he encouraged her in reading.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting from your book that both Lewis's brother and his wife liked detective fiction and they liked Dorothy Sayers, but neither Lewis nor Tolkien ever warmed up to it that much, detective fiction. They were much more interested in fantasy.
Right.
One thing I could think of to answer that question is, because it is fiction, C.S. Lewis loved Sayers' translation of the Purgatorio by Dante. And translating, once again, as we mentioned before, Charles Williams is what got Sayers interested in Dante. She picked up his book during a bombing during World War II and just sat in the bomb shelter, just became intrigued and taught herself Italian so that she could translate Dante into English.
I love that.
Yeah, so they
Which answers the
interacted
old
about.
question: if you were going to a bomb shelter, what one book would you want to take to the bomb shelter with you? To answer that question.
Of course.
Another thing about your book I really enjoyed was the Charles Williams connection. He's the one who really encouraged Dorothy to go ahead and do a translation of Dante, but also the figure of Beatrice by Lewis is finishing up. I mean, very influential on Lewis's thinking. Someone asked, Alan Snyder, who's himself a distinguished Lewis scholar, asked if you had any qualms about talking about the dark side of Charles Williams. Did it bother you to find out and to write about the fact that he wasn't quite the saint that Sayers and Lewis thought he was, but that he had another side that wasn't quite as attractive as the one that we know from from the older biographies?
Yes, it did bother me to some extent. I can't say I wasn't completely unprepared, because, as I say, I had known a little bit about his interest in the occult, but I didn't know quite how deep it went. It actually did go pretty deep, and I kind of. I can't. I'm not the first one to put it out there, obviously.
Right.
At least I used 2 other books quite extensively in my research, and some articles too that I found online. So some of Williams' biographers have done, very extensive work. So I wasn't the first to put this out there, but I knew it would be the first time for some people finding out about it. And yeah, it did bother me. One doesn't like to be the bearer of bad news, so to speak.
Right.
And it's not that you expect anybody to be perfect, but both Lewis and Sayers had, and some others too, I think, had him on such a pedestal that you kind of expected him to at least be, I don't know, at least not be quite into some of these twisted things that he was into. So yeah, it was hard, but it at the same time, I felt like it was necessary to talk fully about all the aspects of the people and the relationships. And I think I learned a lot from it, and I hope others will too. And I think, as we said earlier, he hid these things so successfully during his lifetime and presented such a good face to others, a positive face, that I think he did have a good effect on others in some ways, on Lewis and on Sayers and others. But yes, it was complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah, his life seemed to be kind of compartmentalized.
Very.
Although in his own mind, I think it all fit together, but in a way that to other people, it seems like there's a light side and a dark side. Our friend Gail Harlow from Michigan asked, did you grapple with Charles Williams directly? Did you try to read his novels or his other books and try to decide what the attraction was for Lewis and for Sayers? How much time did you spend actually? She says that Charles Williams was just plain obscure. He's hard to understand. And I wonder how much headway you made with Charles Williams in your research.
Well, I haven't read any of his books recently, but I had read a few of them over the years. Descent into Hell and I think The Place of the Lion and one or two others. And yes, they are very hard, very, very dense, very layered, a little obscure, as you say. I found myself liking them pretty well, but not the kind of books where you say, oh, I want to rush right back and read that over again, because it is not easy.
Right. Well, with a title like Descent into Hell, you shouldn't be expecting too much sunshine and daisies, should you? He's kind of letting
Very
you know.
Very
right.
true. Mm-hmm.
Someone else asked, Lindsay Scholl asked about her views on gender, and I know she didn't like parts of Mere Christianity because he talked about the headship of men in marriage. Could you talk a little bit about grappling with their different opinions on gender roles?
Yes, that was interesting and rather complicated as well. She said to, I think it was Barbara Reynolds, who became her biography, that she really liked Lewis, but that he had a complete blank in his mind when it came to women. And she wasn't harsh about it. She said, he grew up in this all male environment. It's what he's used to. He's not hostile. He tries. Right. She said, but at some level, she thought there was just this place in his mind where he couldn't quite understand women and their concerns and so forth. And so, she was quite forthright about that. And it was an interesting exercise in seeing somebody look at a person holistically, I guess is the word, and seeing, liking them, being friends with them, enjoying that connection with them, and yet understanding that, they have some issues that maybe make it a little bit hard sometimes, and and they're not perfect. So, I do think she helped him in a lot of ways over the years, and she acknowledged too that he had a humility that allowed him to listen to her and listen to other people and learn to acknowledge, oh yes, there are other perspectives out there besides my own. There are other people who look at things in different ways. And so I think he did learn a great deal from her over the years. And I think maybe that blank that she saw became a little less, or even a lot.
Right. Well, I think some of her harshest remarks about Lewis were about gender. In one letter, she said he's like a frightened old bachelor, or some phrase along those lines.
Yeah.
I think Crystal has these
when he talks about women, she writes him back and she says, a lot of thinking women, if they were to hear your argument, they would get a faint sniff of drains.
And it's such an interesting phrase.
Yeah. And of course, drains back then, you're going to get sewage smells in them. So that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, there are more direct ways to say that line. That was very thoughtful of her to put it that way. I have another participant, listener, Kimberly Scott, who says, did they have similar taste in childhood? When you look at Tolkien and Lewis, they both loved fantasy. They liked Rider Haggard. They liked fairy tales. You see much similarity. You start out the book in a very interesting way. You say they were so similar. And you give this whole list of similarities, and yet they were so different. You give a whole list of contrast. Did you find some similarities in early childhood taste in reading between Sayers and Lewis?
Well, the big thing for her, and I think this was when she was maybe in her preteens or thereabouts, was the Three Musketeers. She was crazy about the Three Musketeers. Right. She would even dress up in costumes and make everybody around her, participate in her plays, her skits, whatever, based on the Three Musketeers. And even in later life, she looked back to that as really formative for her. When she discovered Dante and became so wild about Dante, she said, it was kind of like when I first discovered the Three Musketeers. So that stayed with her. So I guess you could say she liked adventure stories, historical fiction, that sort of thing. That was very big for her.
Yeah, and later in life, they both discovered Dante to their lifelong enrichment. I think that was a major literary bond to them later in life.
Mm-hmm.
Another participant or another listener asked, Gary Tandy asked, how about Sayers' experience at school? Lewis was famously negative about his school experiences, and it was very traumatic for him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to overcome those school years. My feeling is that Sayers reveled in school life more than Lewis did. Can you talk a little bit about comparisons or contrasts with their educational years?
Reveled is a very good word for it. She had a really good time at school. She had friends, good friends. She developed friendships that lasted her a lifetime. She loved to go to the theater. She was trying out, I think she was starting to become a writer. She was a voracious reader. She loved to learn. So she would sort of try on different personas almost. She would get very gushy over things. She would have a huge crush on an actor. It was all she could talk about. and so I think she really threw herself into the experience. She had a lot of fun. She liked to be a little frivolous and dress up. And at the same time, she was an avid student and loved to read and to learn. So her experience with school was so much better than Lewis's. If only he could have had half the wonderful experience that she had.
Yeah, yeah.
She loved school.
Mm-hmm.
And it may have been because she was an only child. Lewis had his brother Warney and Arthur Greaves as friends that he shared with. So I think for her, especially being a clergyman's daughter, just to get off and build community. And one of the first things she did after she started Oxford University is start that organization, the Mutual Admiration Society. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Gina?
Well, there's a really good book that just came out about it by Mo Moulton called The Mutual Admiration Society. And these were some of the friendships that sustained her all her life. These were fellow scholars to an extent. I mean, some of them went into writing, some went into teaching, but they all were avid learners, intellectuals, and they did all kinds of things together. I think they did some theater together or some amateur theater, if I remember correctly. So this was just, and they all had different personalities, of course, and there were clashes, but as there always are, but these were friendships that just helped her mind grow and develop and kept her going a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That is her fascination with theater, which goes back to when she's 14 years old and is performing as Athos, as one of the three musketeers. So she would take on the role of one of the musketeers. When she finished some exams at Oxford, she treated herself to 5 plays, like just in a couple days. And that strikes me as very different from Lewis. David, do we know of Lewis going to theater very often?
Well, they liked Wagnerian opera for the storyline and the setting more than for the music. Yes, he went to the theater occasionally, especially when he was young, less so as he got older. So yeah, but I don't think it was integral to his personality the way it was with Sayers.
Yeah.
I have more questions piling up. Can I throw in some more questions from our listeners? Sophie Smith, one of my best students at Wheaton, is asking, can you detect particular places where you say, I'm reading this book by Lewis and I can see the influence of Sayers, or I'm reading something by Sayers and I think this influence comes from Lewis? Can you point to passages where you feel that transformative force is evident on the page?
Yes, there's an essay. It may be on 3 Ways of Writing for Children. I'm not sure, but it's one of Lewis's later essays, I believe. And he talks about how Narnia came out of not some message that he wanted to preach,
Right.
but it just came out of images that were in his head that he
Right.
wanted to create a story about. And he says, you know, the story has to be the thing, and then it will pull into it all the aspects of your thought and of yourself that need to get out there, but the story has to be the first thing. And that's a very Dorothy L. Sayers kind of
Right.
idea. And they had actually bickered about that many years before, because she thought he was too inclined to put the message first, and she was saying, no, you have to write what you feel called to write, and then let the messages, whatever themes, you have to let them just come into it however they come into it. And he sort of felt the same way, but he was hesitant about it. And I think she really pushed him into being willing to say, okay, yes, I see how that works. I see how it has to be that way in order for it to be a good story. And so I like that passage, because you can really see how she got him to think about it that way, and to step up and say, yes, I do think it has to be this way. This is what makes a good story. And so yes, and she liked the Narnia stories very much, in fact. So maybe she could sense that that's what he did. He put the story first, as he was supposed to do.
Right. Right. I'm just going to keep firing questions at you here. This is turning into an interview, isn't it? I mean, like a
Inquisition.
yeah, exactly, an inquisition. Can you give us the first 5 words of the Gospel of John in the New Testament Greek? Are you ready for that question?
No, I cannot.
Well, okay. I'll pitch you an easier one then.
Okay.
Our colleague at Wheaton, probably the most thoughtful and dynamic speaker on C.S. Lewis, is asking a couple of questions as he listens to this conversation. He wonders if they ever compared notes about their BBC experience, since they both were well known for their talks on the BBC or their presentations on the BBC. And he also wants to know if Dorothy really struggled creatively with presenting Jesus Christ as a dramatic character. Did she really ponder the heavy weight of being a creative artist trying to represent the Gospels in a creative form for contemporary readers? That's 2 questions.
Okay. First of all, I don't recall them exchanging. I don't recall significant exchanges about the BBC. I could be forgetting something, but I think that tended to come up only in passing in the letters that I've seen. The second question about portraying Jesus, that's a really great question. I think, and let me preface this by saying that her depiction of Jesus is just wonderful. And she does what so many writers say is the hardest thing to pull off, is create a truly good character who's really compelling. And a great concern of hers, and you can see this throughout The Man Born to be King, is that she doesn't want him to be soft or sentimental. She had a great horror of religious sentimentality. It made her absolutely nauseated. She wanted him to be loving, but also sharp and stern and bracing is a direct quote from that play cycle used to describe Jesus. And not someone who lets people wallow in self-pity over their sins, but who, forgives them, wants them to repent, and then helps them to get on the right road. And so her Jesus is very vigorous, very active. And there's another great quote about him where she, I think the character of Mary Magdalene says that he's the only good man I ever knew who knew what it felt like to be bad, because he could sort of get inside you and see all the horrible things you were doing to yourself. I love that. Right. And she goes on to say, that's why sinners are drawn to him, because they know they're so awful anyhow, that there's no point in trying to hide it. There's no point in beating around the bush. You just come to him and you're drawn in, and you know he understands, even though he is so good. So I think some of those things were sort of the keys to how she built the character. And I think going back to the question of her influence on Lewis, I like to think that her depiction of Jesus sort of influenced a little bit how he saw Jesus, and maybe also how he drew Aslan in Narnia, because I think there are certain qualities they have in common, you know, the mixture of compassion and sternness. And of course you could say, well, that's how Jesus is, and they were both working from, you know, from the real thing. And yet I sort of think that you can detect a little bit of her portrayal in his portrayal. Yeah, that's very true. I have a couple of listeners asking about his response to particular works of hers. Gail Harlow is asking if he read Mind of the Maker, which I know he did, and what did he say about it or think about it. And then I have Bob Goldsboro, a columnist for the Chicago Tribune here in Chicagoland, asking if what he thought of The Zeal of Thy House. What was his response to particular works of hers? As I recall, he liked The Mind of the Maker better than Zeal of Thy House. I don't know. he is, I believe, quoted in The Mind of the Maker, so I don't know if that biased him at all. But I do. He did say that he liked it very much, and I don't think he liked Zeal of Thy House quite as much. When they didn't really care for somebody for one of each other's works, they would sort of go and tell other people about it. So that's that they didn't, you don't really see them getting into it hammer and tongs in their letters over, well, I hated this thing that you wrote, well, I hated that thing that you wrote. They would go off and tell a third party, well, I don't think he should have written this that way, or something like that. But it's interesting to pick up on all those little asides. But yes, he did like The Mind of the Maker very much. I think his woe comment, I think their most direct conflict had to do with his wanting her to write an essay on how it wasn't a good idea to have women in the Anglican Church as priests. And he wanted her to write an essay, and she didn't feel like she was called to do that. I feel like Alex Trebek, I keep changing categories on you here. Maybe your answer should come in the form of a question. Can you comment a bit on their disagreement about weighing in, for her to weigh in on the whether or not it was a good idea to have women as Anglican priests? Well, it wasn't really a huge conflict. I think their biggest one had to do with artistic integrity and that whole issue of writing what you're called to write versus feeling impelled to like write message propaganda, that sort of thing. But as far as the priesthood issue goes, or can women be ordained, he suggested that she write on that, as you say, and she said, I don't think I'm the best person to do that. She felt very bound by tradition in this case, and she said, yes, I think it's probably best to not ordain women, but I hold that view more because of tradition and being ecumenical. I always stumble over that word. Than because of actual theology. She said, you know, this is the whole history of the church has gone one way on this. Other major denominations have gone one way on this. I don't think it's wise to break apart from them. So she didn't really want to write an essay, and I don't think she ever really wrote much on the subject, but that was the view she ended up taking. Good. I have two questions from different readers, Laura Simmons and Steve Park. One is positive. What did you learn new about Lewis and Sayers? Obviously, when you undertake a project like this, you feel fairly acquainted with their body of work and their lives. What emerged that was new for you? And the other side of that question was, did anything emerge that was surprisingly dark or unsettling? Was there a side of Lewis and Sayers that you hadn't noticed before that you uncovered in doing your research? So it's both what was new insight for you and also what was a new discovery in terms of their humanness. it's hard to pinpoint because I had been reading them for so many years before I even started this project.
Right.
I think what I did in preparing the book was get into things chronologically, so to speak, more than I had done in a long time. So, I mean, I arranged the book both sort of thematically and chronologically. So from the beginning to the end of their friendship with her death in 1957. So what I started to realize this time is just how long it took them to even get to anything personal. As I was saying before, that they were professional friends, if you want to put it that way, for something like 5 years, and concentrating solely on work and on theology and on literature and all these things that weren't very personal, which, you know, that's the sort of correspondence that they and friendship that they enjoyed. But eventually a friendship has to get to the personal sometime, I think, and it was that way for them. But it was 5 years at least, I think, before she starts to write to him about her chickens that she just bought. And there's this great letter about the chickens, and I won't give too much away for those who haven't read the book yet, but it's quite funny. And he absolutely loved it. And she said something like, I mustn't weary you with all this cackle, pun intended. And he wrote back and said, no, I loved it. That's one of the times when he said, you are a real letter writer, I am not. So he quite enjoyed the chickens. And after that, I think the ice was broken a little. They could start talking a little bit more about personal things. Okay, so the second question was about some of their humanness, some of their flaws that I discovered. One thing about Serres that came up was, and that, keep in mind, as Crystal said earlier, I wrote a book about being single in the church. I am a single woman, and it had not quite dawned on me before that she was a little bit inclined to, I don't know, to treat singleness as sort of a lack, which, you know, I didn't really care for much. And I think maybe, as I was saying, I think maybe Lewis helped her overcome that a little bit. I think she did overcome it a little bit eventually. I mean, she created some of the great single characters in fiction. I mean, Miss Clemson, who is a wonderful female detective in her detective series. She did have that. So I think maybe she didn't even fully realize all the time that she had this little prejudice. But I think maybe that friendship with a single person, a single man, for that matter, was very good for her, and maybe helped her see things in a somewhat different light.
Mm-hmm. That's another thing I like about your book, Gina, is in the first chapter, you talk about this issue of a friendship, a non-sexual friendship between a male and a female, and that we need to think about that more. And Lewis and Serres can model for us today what a friendship like that can look like.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I've already had some feedback on that, and I think it's making people think a little bit about this. And I'm glad, I hope it is, because it's sort of perennially a hot topic in the church. Of course, everybody wants to avoid danger and temptation and sin, which is important. But I think we also need to think about treating each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, and not just sources of temptation. Now, I've had a little bit of feedback that said, you know, well, it was easy for them and it was safe for them because they were mostly writing letters to each other, and they were far apart, which is true. They did get together sometimes, but they mostly communicated by letter. But I don't really want that to be the takeaway, because I do think that the main takeaway should be that it is possible to have friends of both sexes and to share thoughts and feelings and ideas and to help each other grow spiritually.
Mhm. Mhm.
That was another question I got from one of our listeners, which was, if you had to pinpoint one thing that Lewis did for Sayers in her spiritual journey, what would it be? And if you had to pinpoint one thing that Lewis did for Sayers in her journey, what would that be? Or did I say the same thing twice?
Yeah.
Sorry.
We got what you meant.
That's okay. Well, I think, and we talked about that a little bit before with the whole question of influence. So some concrete things, I think, I'm not quite sure whether she inspired him to write the book Miracles, or
Yeah,
she
very
just
important.
was there at the beginning stages, but she did write to him once and say, we need a book on miracles and you should write it. So
Right.
she could dish it out as well as take it, you know. So sometimes she would bristle at his suggestions, but then she would turn around and give him her suggestions. And he wrote back and said, as a matter of fact, I am writing a book on miracles. So I've never been quite sure from his wording there whether he had already had the idea and she just helped him along, or if she actually gave him the idea. But one way or another, she helped push him in that direction. And I think, and as we know, he ran into some trouble about that book. He was in a debate about it where he felt that he came to feel that he had not maybe made the strongest arguments that he could have. So he went back and did some revising and so forth. Well, all of which I imagine was a growing experience for him and helped him learn a lot. So she was there on the ground floor of that one, you might say. She helped a lot with that.
Yeah, my reading is that she was the catalyst. She got this very arrogant naturalist or skeptic write her and say, how dare you, pretend to believe in all these miracles in the New Testament? And she sent that on to Lewis. That's the famous select rib letter. No, I think she was the catalyst for that book. And George MacDonald has already written a good book on miracles that Lewis knew, but I would give her credit for really getting, he was interesting that often it just took a little suggestion by somebody. Somebody said, why don't you write The Problem of Pain? Why don't you speak for the BBC? He was a little reactive rather than proactive. Somebody would drop an idea in his lap and he'd say, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah,
I would give her credit for that. Yeah.
Right. And we've seen that sometimes Sayers thought he went too far with it and shouldn't just be taking suggestions from all and sundry, but then she didn't mind giving him her own suggestions.
That's right. That's right. I think that's two good takeaways from this conversation. One would be, if you're having sexual temptation, just stick to emails. That'd be one takeaway. And the other one would be, ignore other people's suggestions, but please listen to mine. I think those would be two takeaways from this conversation. Yeah.
Exactly. And he did.
Okay. Yeah.
We are after 8 o'clock, so I want to announce the possibility of getting a free book. Gina, do you have an image of your book you could hold up to the screen so people can see it?
Is that coming through okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lovely looking book. And how we decided that we're going to do this is, if you've listened all the way now to the very end, and email wade@wheaton.edu and put in the subject line free book. The first 3 of you who send an email to the Wade get your free book with Gina's autograph. So, and once again, wade@wheaton.edu. Thank you so much, Gina. We can talk still a few minutes until the 3 winners are announced. Our archivist will be gathering the winners. Do you have any other questions, David, that came in that you want to ask?
Well, I had a question about an illicit relationship between Williams and Sayers, which I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
Yeah,
I have another question from our, I think that rumor is unfounded. I have one from Britton Dickinson, our good friend, about her sense of vocation. He felt that Sayers enunciated her doctrine of vocation much better than Lewis. And he wanted to know if you could comment upon your sense of Lewis's views of calling or vocation. Dorothy Sayers was so good on, why work, and the only good work is, the only Christian work is good work well done. Did you ever try to compare her sense of vocation with Lewis's sense of vocation?
That wasn't something that I really got into a lot. I don't know if he gave it nearly as much thought as she did. It was a very important idea for her. She had thought it through very thoroughly. She kept using it in books like The Mind of the Maker, and it appears all throughout her work and her personal letters as well. So she had, as you say, a very well-shaped view of vocation. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that Lewis really did. You see him sort of trying out some ideas. For instance, I was just reading the other day where he talks about culture, why we have culture. And basically he says, well, he boils it down to, and I'm oversimplifying, but he sort of boils it down to, well, it could be worse, we have to have culture of some kind. That's the way our world is set up. We might as well, make the best of it that we can. And I think I don't know if Sayers read that. I think if she had, she would have probably, written him a sharp letter. But his view is, I don't know quite how to put it, but it's just sort of like, well, we have culture is a thing, it exists, I make my living by it, I have to make a living, so that works, and it's just something we have, and so we have to do the best we can with it, which is so that was sort of the way he attacked some of these things, and maybe he was afraid of making too much of them, and so he went in the opposite direction and sort of made less of them, I guess.
Well, I think you're right. He was living during a time where there was almost a religion of culture. Coming from Matthew Arnold, there was a feeling that Christianity is declining and we need some new platform for spiritual ideals, and that should be aesthetic culture, literature, and art, and all the other wonderful products of the human mind and human creativity. Right. And he thought that was becoming a substitute religion. So I agree with you. I think he played down vocation or culture because he thought it was becoming a competing religion with Christianity. In Christ and culture and in first and second things. He was warning people to not get confused. He said, if you take, if you look for heaven first, the other things will fall into place. But if you try to make something on earth heaven, you're going to create a hell on earth. Right. So I think you're right. He was more wary about that concept than, I wonder if she as a woman was more excited about the idea of vocation, because normally the old cliche was the man has to be the breadwinner or find a job or a career, and the woman would be fine being a homemaker or raising children. And I wonder if her finding a vocation for her was a kind of exciting identity marker that it wouldn't be for Lewis as a male who's expected to find a vocation in one area or another. I'm just speculating, but
that's quite possible. Yes, that's quite possible.
Right.
We have our 3 book winners. If David wants to look in the Q&A, we have their names there.
Okay, I will go down to the end and okay, our 3 winners are David Downing, Crystal Downing, and Laura Schmidt. But it's totally random. Who knew that would happen? No, actually, our 3 winners are Tiffany Martin, Laura Simmons, and Marilyn Graham. Congratulations on having the fastest reflexes.
Yeah.
So this is like Family Feud. Who can get to that button the most quickly? So those 3 have all won a signed copy from Gina of her wonderful book and her stimulating book. And I think you could tell from our conversations tonight how much they will enjoy reading the book and going into more detail on the topics we've been discussing for the last hour or so.
Mm-hmm. And let me announce, if you want to hear more about Sayers, there's going to be another webinar book launch November 9th for my book on Sayers. And Gina, or I should point this way, well, Gina is responsible for my book in that she had recruited me to write an essay for Christianity Today about the relevance of Sayers to our contemporary environment. And so I just wrote up an essay. She gave me good feedback. And after it was published in Christianity Today, the editor of, from a publisher said, I want a whole book on this woman, Dorothy Sayers. So maybe Gina, you can join us then and we can keep this conversation going about Dorothy Sayers.
Oh, I can't wait.
November.
Yeah. Gina wants to know, is there a finder's fee involved? I think that's what she wants to know.
Hey, I owe my publication history and my interest in Sayers to Gina. I have just so much gratitude to you. And thank you for joining us this evening. You are so well informed. You're still teaching me the way you did in the late 90s.
Oh,
thank you so much. Thank
you
you all
Yes, thank you,
for
Gina.
joining us. And hopefully you can join us again.